Today I'm talking about politics in the Gilded Age, and specifically the Gilded Age presidents and some of their particular policies. The cartoon that you see here to introduce this topic, you see President Hayes, and he's holding a baby. The baby doesn't look too well, and the baby represents civil service, and civil service, of course, are all the people who work for the government, who are appointed to those jobs. And the government, at this point, many people wanted to reform the civil service system to make it better so that it wasn't just all about who you knew, but what you knew. But you can see that neither political party, neither the Republicans on the left here, nor the Democrats really wanted much to do with this issue. They were both turning their backs on it, so to speak. But that is definitely something that some of these presidents will be working to achieve, is reforming the civil service system. For the most part, the government in this period had a laissez-faire approach, that type of hands-off approach to business, and that the role of the government should be very, very limited. However, a lot of American businesses wanted some government interference. They wanted interference that would be favorable to them. They favored high tariffs, and we've talked about those tariffs before because those protect American industry from foreign competition. And they wanted subsidies, or their payments from the government that will help the businesses grow and develop. And remember, the railroad had been receiving subsidies for quite a while. The government felt that it was important to provide subsidies for the railroads so that the railroads would be able to be built and expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and that was one way that the transcontinental railroad was developed. So there was definitely a group of people in this country who wanted the government to be involved, but certainly to the benefit of business. So now again I'm going to talk about the difference between Democrats and Republicans. Previous to the Civil War, we definitely saw a divide between the two parties that mostly dealt with the issue of slavery and states' rights. Now in the Gilded Age, we're going to look at these two parties based on business and how they feel about finances and such. So for the Democrats, generally we're speaking of people who are less privileged. The supporters of this party would be immigrants living in northern cities. They would be southern planters, the same kind of people who owned the plantations prior to the Civil War, and farmers in the West. Now, they advocate an increased money supply backed by silver, and what this creates is inflation. Now, farmers like inflation because that means that they are making more off of the products that they are selling. They also prefer low tariffs because then the goods that they're purchasing are going to be lower in price. And they want less aid to big business. They also advocate fewer blue laws, and those blue laws are kind of those laws that regulate moral behavior. That is something that goes back to the Puritans. If you remember when we talked about the Puritans, we talked about blue laws. The Republicans tend to be wealthier. They're supported by business owners, bankers. Farmers that are more in the east, they want a tight money supply backed by gold, and this is a situation that slows down the rate of inflation. They want high tariffs, of course, to protect their businesses. They want government subsidies to the railroads. They want limits on immigration. They would like stricter blue laws, stricter laws that regulate moral conduct and behavior. And they tend to wave the bloody shirt. And what this refers to is bringing up the Civil War and the destruction and bloodshed of the Civil War over and over again, because they certainly blame the Democrats for that, because the Democrats were the party of the South and still to a great extent are. So they keep bringing that up, the destruction that the Civil War caused, and that they largely blame that on the Democrats. One of the biggest issues in domestic politics in the Gilded Age was the spoils system, also known as the patronage system. And of course, we began to talk about this when we talked about Andrew Jackson. This is the practice of elected officials giving government jobs to friends and loyal supporters. And it also led to a lot of corruption and bribery. So in the cartoon that you're seeing here, you're seeing Ulysses S. Grant is the man in the middle here. And of course, he served as president from 1869 to 1877. Right before the period that we're talking about here. And he has a government cake here, and everybody is pulling at him because they all want a piece of this, and they're all saying, let us have a piece, let us have a piece. And Grant himself is saying, let us have peace, P-E-A-C-E, but everybody wants a piece of the action. Everybody who has supported him wants a job in government, wants to be part of this spoils system. And so what you will see is the next president, Hayes, really make a strong attempt to reform this spoils system, especially after all of the corruption and bribery and graft that had gone on during Grant's time in office. Rutherford B. Hayes is the first of the Gilded Age presidents we'll talk about, and we've talked about him before because his election was part of the Compromise of 1877. That's what gained him the office of the presidency. He was a Republican. He refused to use the patronage system to appoint supporters to jobs, and he began to reform the civil service. And the civil service really refers to the non-elected workers in the government. He did not run for a second term in 1880, so he will be a one-term Republican president. James Garfield was elected in 1880. He becomes president in 1881. He was a Republican. He wanted to reform the spoils system, but he also wanted to remain loyal to the Republican Party. And that party had split into three factions over civil service reform, and you've read about these factions, the stalwarts, the half-breeds, and the independents. Unfortunately, Garfield was assassinated. He was shot by a man named Charles Guiteau, and he died 3 months later from his wounds. Guiteau was a kind of deluded figure who definitely believed he was more important than he really was, and he expected James Garfield to give him a job. At one point he thought he could be the ambassador to Vienna, and then later he thought he could be an ambassador to France and be sent over to Paris. But none of those things were going to happen. He soon began to realize, so he shot Garfield at a train station. Guiteau, I may have mentioned before, he was part of the Oneida community. He went to live in that group for a period of time. You may remember them. They're one of those utopian communities. They believed in free love, so they had multiple sexual partners and such. Guiteau apparently wasn't too popular there, and he ended up leaving that community. In any event, the assassination turned the public against the spoils system because a lot of that was blamed on the fact that the Republican Party had split, and there were these various factions that had emerged over this issue. Upon Garfield's death, Chester A. Arthur, his vice president, will become president, serving from 1881 to 1885, and he also supported civil service reform. The biggest contribution when he was in office is the Pendleton Civil Service Act passed in 1883. This created a civil service commission, which created a testing for candidates for government jobs. It also stated that federal employees could not be required to contribute to campaigns. So it really meant that your job was not dependent on giving campaigns and support to particular candidates. Your job was dependent on passing a test and being qualified for that job. So this is a big, important step in civil service reform that you should definitely remember. Grover Cleveland was the first Democrat elected since the Civil War. He served from 1885 to 1889, and he was the first and only president who has served 2 non-consecutive terms in office. You'll see he favored a tight money policy backed by gold. That was to slow down the rate of inflation. He also opposed tariffs, which were so popular with big business, and he took back grants of federal land to the railroads, which he felt was a practice that was being abused. He was also an interesting character because he had served as mayor of Buffalo, he had served as governor of New York State, and during his time in Buffalo, he had fathered a child out of wedlock, which was a pretty big deal for the late 1800s. He also ended up marrying a young woman who was 27 years younger than him, who was from Buffalo as well, and that was the first wedding of a president that took place in the White House, and the only wedding of a president that took place in the White House. He also had 3 children who were born in the White House during his time as president. Next, we have Benjamin Harrison, who served from 1889 to 1893. He is actually the grandson of William Henry Harrison, who you learned about previously, the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe, who unfortunately only served 1 month in office because he died very soon in. Benjamin Harrison is a Republican. He favored increased tariffs, and that helped him gain the support of business. But he will lose the next election to Grover Cleveland. So this is Grover Cleveland's second term that we're talking about here. He won again based on raising tariffs, so getting the support of business in that way. But there was a panic, a depression in 1893 that brought a lot of economic hardship onto the country. He did tighten the money supply to try to slow down the rate of inflation, but that was hurtful to the farmers. He also sent troops to end the Pullman strike that you've learned about previously, because that was interfering with the delivery of the U.S. mail, so that was his justification for sending troops in to end that strike. He did not receive a nomination from his own party in the 1896 election. He had not made a lot of friends amongst the working class, a lot of which had to do with the way he sent in troops to end the Pullman strike. So that will be his last term in office.